Hello. I'd like to tell you now of the time my dreams of reaching a wider audience were crushed by an editor who didn't know how a balance sheet worked. I am Jeff Rocca, the canny financier, and in the past I have written for a certain investing website, which I will not be identifying for legal reasons, and at one point I contributed an article on Borg Warner, a maker of auto parts technologies, mainly in the electrification and fuel efficiency spaces. This happened April of last year, but I'm still annoyed and I hope you'll see why. One of the key points of my recommendation was that it had on its balance sheet about $2 billion of extra cash, which it had earned from a few highly profitable years and which it hadn't gotten round to deploying in the form of dividends or share repurchases yet. Other than that, the valuation was fairly straightforward, considering the free cash flow yield based on the length of a business cycle, because automotive technology is a cyclical company, and also looking at the company's competitive position, which was fairly strong, as fuel efficiency is a perennially important topic. And the company had that massive free cash flow yield on top of spending more than $1 billion in R&D every year. So if you look at this summary valuation, you see they have $600 million per year in earnings power averaged across a business cycle, to which I applied a conservative 8 times multiplier because they're in a cyclical sector. And then you add in $1.8 billion in excess cash and $400 million from the fact that their borrowings are in a lower interest rate than current, and you get $7 billion in estimated value for the company. And at the time, the company's market cap was $5.3 billion, so it was a clear bargain situation. And when I did this calculation of earnings power, I did scrupulously remove all of the income thrown off by their cash balance from the overall figure so as to avoid double counting. So, what is excess cash? Is that even a thing? Well, yes. You see, a company holds cash primarily for liquidity and because it's worried about dealing with current liabilities. So basically you subtract current liabilities from non-cash current assets to see how much liquidity the company is going to have to come up with over the next year. If that figure is negative, that is more cash the company is going to have to come up with. But if that figure is positive, that means that there is cash that the company doesn't need to produce liquidity. And so any cash in excess of that is excess cash. And as the company doesn't need it, it's presumably available for the use of the shareholders. And this isn't just my opinion. Excess cash is a non-operating asset, and thinkers across the financial world, Greenblatt, Mabussan, even Warren Buffett, are on the lookout for non-operating assets that they can sell off and deploy for the benefit of their owners. Now in Borg Warner's case, all of their $2 billion in change in cash was considered excess cash by that formula. But obviously a company needs some cash so they don't have to keep going to the bank whenever anything comes up. So a good rule of thumb is to keep, say, 3% of sales on hand for a mature company, and so that knocked the excess cash figure down to $1.8 billion, which is what I put in my valuation. But at this point, my editor stepped in and pointed out that the company had $3.7 billion in debt, and if I was going to give them credit for the excess cash, I had to subtract the $3.7 billion in debt. So the company was only worth $4.5 billion. And at this point you can imagine my confusion, because I'd been valuing the company's equity, not the company's enterprise value, which is equity and debt added together. And as you saw from the thumbnail, you subtract debt from assets to produce equity. You subtract debt from equity to produce what? Double equity? And as I said, the cash belongs to the equity holders. The debtors are entitled to their flow of principal and interest payments, but apart from any covenants to the contrary, the company can do with whatever cash is not required to make those payments whatever it pleases. And for an investment-grade company, there are usually no covenants restricting the use of cash, and there weren't in BorgWarner's case. I checked. Looking at the problem another way, here is the formula for enterprise value, which is equity plus debt minus cash. And it can be also arrived at independently by looking at the total free cash flow to the firm and subtracting out the debt component, as I have done here. You will also notice the minus cash term and the fact that debt appears only once and not twice. Now, if we treat the cash as a separate asset alongside debt and equity, then it's entitled to its own cost of capital, and the income it throws off becomes part of the free cash flow to the firm. And since both of those figures are 5%, which is what interest rates were back then, we arrive exactly where we started. And put a simpler way, it is obvious that the $4.5 billion my editor arrived at was less than the $4.8 billion the equity was worth without counting the cash. So the company was worth more money without the $2.1 billion on the balance sheet than with it. I might have explained these in my conversation with the editor somewhat less than clearly, but frankly I was stunned into inarticulacy by the fact that he and the two senior editors he ran it by were convinced that I have to subtract debt from assets twice. Of course, the punchline of this whole sordid affair was that at the time I wrote the article, BorgWarner was at 26, and it shot up to well into the 70s, at which point I sold it. So I guess we're all very fortunate that the website's readership was spared the burden of my opinion. You know, I'm reminded of a story from Benjamin Graham's career. He worked out that a certain railroad company had enough treasury bonds on its balance sheet to buy back every single share of the company outstanding. And he wrote to the board of directors suggesting that they do exactly that. And the railroad company told him, "Well, sir, we know how to run a railroad company better than you, and if you disagree, feel free to sell your shares." And Ben said, "I don't want to sell my shares. I want to buy more shares. In fact, I want to buy so many shares that I take over the company just so I can fire you." Unfortunately, he didn't get to do that, but he did get hold of one of the railroad's major shareholders who saw the matter his way. Although I think it would have been funny to see how the exchange would cope with a negative share price because of a special dividend. But yes, don't be like my editor, and hopefully make sure all of your investment ideas have a proper court of appeal. And don't subscribe to this website I haven't named, and regard all of the articles published there with suspicion. Thank you, and please like and subscribe and so forth.